On a Monday morning in March of 1968, 22-year-old Danny Jarvis drove his dying Farmall H into the paved parking lot of Becker Equipment in Caddo County, Oklahoma. The tractor was making a terrifying sound that no machine should ever make, a deep, grinding, metallic death rattle that had started 3 days earlier and grown worse with every hour of field work. Danny had nursed the machine 12 miles from his farm, praying with every rotation of the tires that it would survive the trip. It barely did. Carl Becker, the wealthy owner of the John Deere dealership, stepped out of his pristine showroom to deliver the absolute death sentence. The crankshaft was completely cracked. Fixing it would cost him exactly $800. Danny Jarvis stood in the freezing March wind, staring at the broken heart of his farm with exactly $23 in his faded pockets, entirely out of options. Let me tell you about Danny Jarvis, because to truly understand the sheer desperation of this moment, you need to understand the crushing weight this young man was carrying. Danny was born in 1946, the second son of Harold and Mary Jarvis. The Jarvis family farm consisted of 160 acres of tough, unforgiving Oklahoma red dirt. It was not the best agricultural land in the county, nor was it the worst. It was simply honest ground that generously rewarded exhausting physical labor and ruthlessly punished any sign of hesitation or laziness. In the spring of 1965, when Danny was only 19 years old, his father Harold suffered a massive sudden heart attack and died right in the middle of the crucial planting season. Danny's older brother had already abandoned the rural life for the booming oil fields down in Texas, and his younger sister was only 14 years old and still attending high school. That left Danny completely alone, without any transition, without any formal training, and absolutely without any other choice. He buried his father on a Tuesday and took over the entire farming operation on a Wednesday. He was suddenly responsible for keeping 160 acres alive, managing a mountain of invisible debts his father had quietly accumulated, and ensuring his grieving family did not lose their only home. Standing in the dealership parking lot 3 years later, Danny was facing the absolute destruction of everything he had fought so bitterly to keep. The dying Farmall H was the only functional tractor he owned. It was the exact same machine his father had bought, used in 1952, the machine Danny had painstakingly learned to drive on, and the only piece of heavy equipment keeping the Jarvis farm financially viable. Now, it was functionally dead just 3 weeks before the critical spring planting window. Carl Becker, a 53-year-old man who had spent 25 highly profitable years selling expensive new machinery, looked at the desperate young farmer with cold, calculating eyes. Carl did not offer sympathy or understanding. He offered a brutal business transaction. He told Danny that the broken tractor was worthless and offered to buy the entire machine for a miserable $200 in raw scrap metal value. Danny quietly explained that he could not afford to buy a replacement tractor, and without a working machine, his family would inevitably lose the farm to the bank. This is exactly where the story takes a deeply frustrating turn, revealing precisely what kind of man Carl Becker was behind his polished, professional showroom smile. Carl casually patted the young man on the shoulder and told him that modern farming was a rich man's game now. He smoothly suggested that Danny should simply take the $200, give up the ridiculous dream of running the family farm, and go find a reliable hourly factory job in the city. What Danny did not know, and what he would not discover, until many years later was the predatory nature of Carl's advice. Carl had already made a quiet, speculative phone call to the regional bank earlier that morning. Carl knew the Jarvis family was severely behind on their agricultural loans. As a wealthy local businessman with deep financial ties, Carl had secretly arranged to purchase the foreclosed lease on Danny's 160 acres for absolute pennies the very moment the boy defaulted. Carl did not just want to buy Danny's broken tractor for cheap scrap. He actively wanted the young boy to fail entirely so he could flip the vulnerable Jarvis farm to a much wealthier corporate client for a massive personal profit. Carl stood there in his perfectly clean, expensive shirt, smelling of expensive aftershave and new rubber tires, confidently waiting for the exhausted 22-year-old to surrender to the inevitable. He expected Danny to politely take the insulting $200, walk away in defeat, and leave the dealership in permanent failure. But Carl Becker fundamentally misunderstood exactly who he was dealing with. He looked at the cracked engine block and saw only rusted scrap iron. He looked at the young, dirt-stained farmer and saw only an uneducated, helpless kid who was out of options. Carl Becker was absolutely certain that his vast money and his elevated social position gave him total control over the situation. He had no idea that this quiet, desperate young man was about to teach him a permanent, humiliating lesson about the dangerous difference between wealth and actual, unyielding mechanical capability. Danny Jarvis did not reach for the miserable $200. He stood his ground in the freezing March wind and looked directly into the polished, confident face of the John Deere dealer. Instead of accepting defeat, Danny asked a quiet question that would ultimately change the entire trajectory of both their lives. He asked Carl Becker what would happen if he simply took the engine apart and welded the cracked crankshaft back together himself. Carl stared at the dirt-stained 22-year-old for a long second before he burst into a loud, theatrical laugh. It was not a mean laugh, exactly, but rather the condescending chuckle of a man who has just heard something completely absurd. The sound carried across the paved parking lot, drawing the attention of several dealership mechanics who stepped out of the service bays to watch the entertainment. Carl shook his head, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye, and told Danny that fixing a cracked crankshaft was not some weekend project you tackle in a drafty barn with a hammer and blind hope. He explained with dripping condescension that a crankshaft requires absolute precision machining, a specialized machine shop, specialty tools, and years of formal engineering training. When Danny stubbornly asked how much the actual welding rods would cost, Carl let out a heavy sigh of exasperation. He told the young farmer that specialty rods might cost $5 or $10 at the local hardware store, but buying them would be throwing his absolute last dollars into a fire. Carl stated with unshakable certainty that a homemade weld on an engine's main rotational axis would never hold. He promised it would violently shatter within a month, perhaps even within a single week, destroying the entire engine block in the process. Danny was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his broken tractor, then back at the wealthy dealer. He simply nodded, climbed back onto his agonizingly loud machine, and said he would take his chances. As the dying Farmall H limped out of the parking lot, the grinding sound getting worse with every single mile, Carl confidently told his mechanics that the boy was about to learn a very expensive lesson about things that simply cannot be fixed. But what Carl Becker did not know was that Danny Jarvis had a secret advantage. Back in high school, while other boys were playing football or chasing girls, Danny had spent every free period in the shop class. His teacher, Mr. Patterson, was a former United States Navy master welder who had spent World War II meticulously repairing shattered armor plating on enormous military battleships. Mr. Patterson had taught Danny that welding was not just about melting metal together. It was an absolute art form. It was about understanding exactly how heavy metal behaves, how it expands when it heats, how it shrinks when it cools, and how different alloys react under extreme stress. Danny had mastered it. He possessed incredibly steady, patient, and precise hands. Danny drove the agonizing 12 miles back to his farm, listening to the terrifying metallic death rattle of his engine. He only had $23 to his name, but he also had the absolute patience of a Navy welder and a burning desire to prove the arrogant dealership owner wrong. Danny drove the agonizing 12 miles back to his farm, nursing the dying Farmall H and praying with every rotation of the tires that the engine would not tear itself apart completely before he reached the barn. By the time he pulled into the dim, quiet space of his machine shed, the grinding death rattle was deafening. He spent the entirety of Monday methodically taking the engine apart. It was incredibly slow, careful work, as he had never fully disassembled a tractor engine before, and he absolutely could not afford to accidentally break a single functioning component. By Tuesday morning, he had successfully extracted the massive, heavy steel crankshaft and hoisted it onto his wooden workbench. The catastrophic damage was immediately obvious once he cleaned off the heavy black oil. It was a jagged hairline fracture running directly across one of the main bearing journals, exactly the kind of terminal damage that Carl Becker had smugly promised would reduce the machine to cheap scrap metal. Danny stood in the quiet barn and stared at the cracked steel for a long time, thinking deeply about what Mr. Patterson had taught him regarding extreme stress, heat distribution, and the violent physical forces inside an internal combustion engine. He knew that a regular, hasty weld would completely fail. The immense twisting pressure of the engine would simply crack the brittle joint again within days, or perhaps even hours. But Danny was not planning to do a regular weld. That afternoon, he drove his rusted pickup truck into town and walked into the local hardware store. He bypassed the standard cheap materials and spent $12 of his precious $23 on specialized high-stress welding rods. He then drove to the auto parts store and spent another $3 on a heavy grinding wheel and a set of precision metal files. His total financial investment to save his family farm was exactly $15. He returned to the barn on Tuesday night and began the painstaking preparation. Using the new grinding wheel, he carefully ground out the hairline crack, cutting deep into the thick steel to create a wide V-shaped groove that would allow the new molten metal to penetrate completely down to the core of the journal. Then came the most crucial step, the step that arrogant mechanics often completely ignored. Danny did not immediately strike an arc. Instead, he slowly and carefully preheated the entire massive steel crankshaft. He gradually raised the temperature of the cold metal so that it would expand uniformly, ensuring that the localized heat of the welding torch would not create sudden Microscopic stress fractures in the surrounding steel when it eventually cooled. Only when the thick steel was deeply saturated with heat did Danny put on his heavy leather gloves and drop his welding hood. The actual welding process was a grueling 4-hour marathon of absolute concentration. He worked with the rhythmic, breathing patience that the old Navy welder had drilled into him, never rushing, never forcing the process, simply letting the melting metal dictate the pace. He laid down slow, methodical passes, meticulously building up layer after layer of glowing new steel inside the deep groove until it sat slightly higher than the original surface. When the agonizing 4-hour weld was finally complete, Danny did not turn off the lights and go to sleep. He immediately wrapped the blistering hot crankshaft tightly in several heavy, thick insulating blankets. He was forcing the massive piece of steel to undergo an agonizingly slow 12-hour cooling process. He knew that any rapid exposure to the cold March air would instantly shock the metal, causing it to crystallize, contract violently, and undo all of his flawless work. He left the bundled steel on the workbench and finally walked back to the farmhouse to collapse into bed. On Thursday morning, he unwrapped the cooled steel and began the tedious finishing work. He spent hours grinding, filing, and polishing the raised weld by hand until the surface was flawlessly smooth, blending the new metal perfectly into the old until you almost could not tell where the catastrophic crack had originally been. Using precision measurement tools he had carefully borrowed from his old high school shop teacher, he checked the absolute alignment, the delicate rotational balance, and the perfect roundness of the newly repaired bearing journal. It was as close to absolute perfection as human hands could possibly achieve without $1 million machine shop. Danny spent Thursday night and the entirety of Friday morning painstakingly reassembling the heavy tractor engine, torquing every single bolt back to its exact factory specification. By late Friday afternoon, the Farmall H was completely put back together. Danny climbed up into the weathered metal seat, took a deep breath, and said a quiet prayer to whatever forces protect desperate farmers. He firmly turned the ignition key and engaged the starter. The engine turned over heavily once, coughed a puff of black smoke, and then roared to beautiful, continuous life. It sounded incredibly strong and perfectly smooth. Danny let the heavy machine idle in the barn for a full hour, sitting motionless in the seat, listening intensely for any sign of a knock, a rattle, or a catastrophic failure. There was nothing but the steady, reliable heartbeat of a healthy engine. He engaged the transmission, drove the tractor out into the bright spring sunshine, and took it across the rough, uneven dirt of his fields. He pushed the throttle, testing the heavy load against the repaired steel spinning furiously inside the engine block. The machine performed flawlessly. Against every rule of modern mechanics, against the arrogant certainty of the wealthy dealership owner, the $15 weld was holding perfectly. News travels incredibly fast in small agricultural communities. By the following Monday morning, absolutely everyone in Caddo County knew that 22-year-old Danny Jarvis had welded his own cracked crankshaft and that the impossible repair had actually worked. Carl Becker drove his expensive dealership truck out to the Jarvis farm just to see it for himself. He found the young man out in the field, actively plowing the tough Oklahoma dirt with the old Farmall H. The engine was running perfectly. Carl stood at the edge of the field, quietly listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of an engine that he had confidently declared dead. When Danny stopped the tractor and climbed down, Carl shook his head slowly, admitting that in 25 years of business, he had never seen a welded crankshaft hold together. He leaned in close to the heavy iron block, confessing that it sounded entirely healthy. However, Carl's deeply ingrained arrogance would not let him fully concede defeat. He looked at Danny and warned him that the extreme internal stress would inevitably win. Carl promised that the weld might hold for a month or maybe a year, but it would ultimately shatter. Danny simply smiled, wiped his hands on a rag, and replied that if it broke, he would just weld it again. Carl laughed, offered the boy a job repairing unfixable things, and drove away when Danny politely declined. To truly understand how this $15 weld changed the county, we have to look at the next 18 years. The high-stress weld held perfectly. It held for all of 1968, and it held through the scorching summers of the 1970s. The old Farmall worked the Jarvis fields season after season, and the impossible repair refused to break. Word of his incredible mechanical skill continued to spread. Desperate neighbors started bringing Danny their own broken equipment. They brought cracked transmission housings, shattered hydraulic cylinders, and snapped heavy axle shafts. These were expensive failures that the wealthy dealerships explicitly said could not be repaired. Danny methodically fixed them all. By 1975, Danny had earned a legendary reputation. Farmers started calling him Junkyard Danny. It had initially started as a mocking insult from the wealthy dealership owners, but the desperate farmers quickly turned it into a profound badge of honor. If you had a heavy machine that the expensive professionals said was dead, you took it to Junkyard Danny. His old wooden barn slowly transformed into a massive professional workshop. He bought a proper welding setup, a heavy metal lathe, and a milling machine, all paid for in cash. Through it all, his original Farmall H kept running perfectly. While Danny was quietly building a highly profitable repair business based on absolute mechanical mastery and zero debt, Carl Becker was aggressively building an empire on fragile promises and predatory loans. The 1970s were an unprecedented economic boom for American agriculture. Crop prices were incredibly high, credit was recklessly easy to get from the local banks, and everyone was aggressively expanding their operations. Carl pushed farmers hard to trade in their reliable, paid-off machines for shiny new John Deere models financed on expensive 5-year loans. He confidently told them that old equipment was just costing them money every single day, and that massive debt was simply the modern cost of doing business. The hardworking farmers trusted his decades of authority. They signed the complicated loan papers without reading the fine print. Carl became incredibly wealthy on paper, completely unaware that he was building a massive house of cards that was destined to fall. The devastating farm crisis violently hit the Midwest in the early 1980s. Interest rates suddenly skyrocketed into the high teens. Commodity prices crashed completely through the floor, and agricultural land values instantly collapsed. The farmers, who had blindly followed Carl's advice, suddenly found themselves completely underwater, owing more money than their entire farms were actually worth. Carl Becker's wealthy dealership immediately began to bleed. By 1983, Carl was bitterly repossessing vastly more tractors than he was actually selling. His pristine paved parking lot was completely overflowing with repossessed, unsold machinery that absolutely nobody could afford to buy. The regional banks began asking Carl incredibly uncomfortable questions about his own commercial loans. As the brutal financial crisis deepened, the struggling farmers stopped buying anything new. Instead, they embraced a strict new survival motto: fix it, do not replace it. And nobody fixed broken machinery better than Junkyard Danny. While Carl Becker's arrogant empire slowly bled to death under the crushing weight of bad debt, Danny Jarvis was quietly thriving, saving his hard-earned cash in the bank and watching the world change. By the spring of 1986, Carl Becker's massive dealership went completely bankrupt. The bank immediately seized the expensive building, padlocked the shiny showroom doors, and scheduled a massive foreclosure auction. The stage was officially set for the ultimate reckoning. In April of 1986, the massive foreclosure auction of Becker equipment officially took place. Danny Jarvis stood quietly at the back of the diminished crowd. The shiny new tractors and expensive tools were sold off for absolute pennies on the dollar to a crowd that had very little left to spend. Finally, the massive dealership building itself came up for bid. The opening ask was $60,000. A few hesitant hands went up. Then Danny calmly raised his hand. The other desperate bidders looked at him, knowing him only as Junkyard Danny, the quiet man who fixed the unfixable. What they did not know was that Danny had spent the last 18 years quietly saving his hard-earned cash while the rest of the county drowned in predatory loans. When the bidding finally stopped, Danny Jarvis bought the entire dealership for $82,000 in pure cash. As he signed the final paperwork, a broken, deeply humbled Carl Becker approached him. The once arrogant dealer looked completely defeated. He quietly asked Danny if that $15 weld was actually still holding. Danny smiled gently and told him it had been 18 years and counting. Carl laughed a sad, tired laugh and admitted he had been completely wrong about everything. Danny shook his head and replied that Carl was actually right about the physics of a regular weld. He simply did not realize Danny had the patience to do it correctly. Danny extended his hand, offering absolutely no hard feelings. When Carl quietly asked what Danny planned to do with the massive building, Danny said he was going to keep fixing broken things. Then, in the ultimate act of grace, Danny looked at the old man who had once mocked him and asked if he could start working for him on Monday.
To truly appreciate the sheer magnitude of Danny's victory, we need to look at the extreme mechanical physics of what he actually accomplished. A crankshaft is the most highly stressed component in any engine, constantly absorbing thousands of pounds of explosive percussive pressure. Because of this terrifying environment, they are forged from high carbon steel or specialized cast iron. Carl Becker was theoretically right to laugh, because in the professional world, welding a cracked crankshaft is universally considered a foolish impossibility. When you apply the extreme heat of a welding torch to high carbon steel, the cold metal expands violently. If it cools even slightly too quickly, it creates severe thermal shock. The carbon molecules lock into a highly brittle, glass-like structure, forming invisible, microscopic stress fractures. The exact moment that brittle weld is subjected to the explosive twisting forces of a running farm engine, it violently shatters. But Danny survived because he understood the absolute mastery of thermal dynamics. By spending hours slowly preheating the massive steel block to achieve deep heat saturation, and then forcing an agonizingly slow 12-hour cooling process wrapped in heavy thermal blankets, He completely prevented the metal from crystallizing. He entirely defeated the predictable science of failure with the unstoppable science of mechanical mastery. The story of Danny Jarvis is a powerful reminder that the true difference between worthless scrap metal and a working machine is often just the stubborn willingness to try. If you deeply appreciate these incredible stories of forgotten mechanical engineering, raw hard work, and the timeless value of the old ways, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Please note that while the fundamental principles of metallurgy, engine repair, and the historical events of the agricultural crisis are entirely real, this specific narrative has been carefully dramatized and fictionalized to honor the enduring spirit of the farmers and the incredible mechanics who physically kept this country running.